Presidential advisor. After a stint as a law teacher, Hill quit his job and opened the George Washington Institute in 1915, which taught self-confidence and wealth creation. Learning from his experience, Hill tried a different, more sophisticated scam. Postage magazine described Hill's school as a corporation, with the founders valuing it $100,000 divided into 10,000 shares. Hill kept 51% of the shares and sold the rest to students at $10 a share. But the company label Hill valued at $100,000 was worthless. In March 1918, authorities began investigating Hill's school for financial fraud. The Chicago Daily Tribune published an investigation report showing that Hill's school had only a few desks, chairs, a printing press, and other miscellaneous items worth about wholly $200. However, this was just one way Hill made money when he also cheated students of their tuition fees. Specifically, Hill established the First National Trust Association and invited students to borrow money from them to pay tuition fees at an interest rate of 5%. This means that students will borrow money from their own tuition to pay Hill back, then repay the debt plus 5% interest. In June 1918, a warrant was issued for Hill's arrest and he was indicted. It is unclear how Hill resolved the case and whether he repaid the students, but subsequent scams in the following years suggest that Hill somehow escaped punishment. Despite this, Hill's memoirs record the final years of World War I very differently. The author says he was invited to serve as an advisor to U.S. President Woodrow Wilson to help end the war. Hill says he accepted the offer without taking a penny, doing it out of patriotism. Ironically, in a state of near bankruptcy, Hill worked for free out of patriotism, while the president didn't even know what Hill's major was. According to Novak's investigation, this advisory story is also imaginary because there's no data recording President Wilson's appointment of Hill as an advisor. Charity scam. After the George Washington Institute failed, Hill founded Hill's Golden Rule magazine, which helped companies cheat investors. In October 1919, the Federal Trade Commission fined Hill's newspaper for advertising fraud. Hill then opened the Intra-Wall Correspondence School in 1922, with the goal of raising funds to educate Ohio prison inmates and help them reintegrate into society. However, the school was just a front for Hill to scam charity money, sell his magazine, and other get-rich-quick courses. The Mansfield News in Ohio reported on December 21st, 1923, that Hill easily raised $1,000 or $14,000 in today's dollars on a single fundraising trip. He usually targeted churches and religious people and did not stay long in each town to solicit donations. Of course, no money was ever sent to the Ohio State Prison. In a 1923 interview with the Mansfield Journal, the Pithomas Prison authorities said they had never received a penny from Hill. However, this time Hill learned his lesson by letting a convicted criminal, Butler R. Stork, be the principal of Intra School. Therefore, when the incident broke out, Stork himself had to return to prison, and it did not affect Hill at all. Thomas Edison, one of the few photos Hill had of a celebrity, was of Thomas Edison. The Specialty Salesman magazine in 1923 described the meeting as quite casual, with Hill claiming to be the magazine's editor who wanted to award Edison a medal for his contributions. Of course, the inventor agreed, even to have his picture taken. But what Hill captioned the photo was far from reality. Two famous Americans, Thomas A. Edison, left, and Napoleon Hill, right. Mr. Edison was the inventor of the phonograph, the electric light, the moving picture, and many other things that served humanity. Mr. Hill was the editor of Napoleon Hill magazine and the New Philistine. He believed in the golden rule, the law of all human behavior. Edison was born into a poor family and began his career as a newspaper boy on a train. Hill began his career working in a coal mine. Both achieved greatness through their own efforts. Receiving the medal, Edison decided to return it to Hill without further comment. In fact, most of the people Hill claimed to have met, other than Thomas Edison, have no evidence. Hill said he had many papers and photos to prove it, but they were destroyed in a fire in the mid-1920s. self-help in early 1928, Hill sensed an opportunity to make money from publishing self-help books and secrets to getting rich. This was the period when the American economy began to fall into the Great Depression of the 1930s. And of course, everyone wanted to forget the pain of reality to learn how to get rich. Hill borrowed money from his wife's wealthy family to write the book, Law of Success. Because he was bankrupt, Hill had to borrow money from his brother-in-law to buy a decent suit and rent a luxury hotel room in Philadelphia to impress publisher Andrew Pelton into agreeing to publish the book. Every time he met Pelton, Hill lavished tips on everyone in the hotel, from the bellboy to the receptionist, to prove his success. Pelton eventually agreed, and the book sold well because it suited the reader's taste, although Pelton himself admitted that it was not really a good book. In early 1929, Hill earned about $2,500 a month from book sales, equivalent to $35,000 today. However, this amount of money was nothing compared to Hill's lavish lifestyle. Hoping to prove his success in the upper class, for the first time in years, Hill moved his wife Florence and children into a luxury apartment in New York. However, the Great Depression of the 1930s affected Hill as he had no income except from book sales. In the mid-1930s, his wife Florence and children had to move back to her mother's house when Hill sold their luxury apartment to pay off debts. The book, The Magic Ladder to Success, that Hill had hoped to revive his career, could not be published, and he officially went bankrupt, returning to a life of being a parasite at his wife's house. Think and grow rich. After this failure, Hill continued to open a new magazine called Inspiration Magazine to continue his scam. In 1933, Hill proudly announced that the administration of U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt had approached him to be an advisor to restore the U.S. economy. Of course, this story was fabricated when Hill went bankrupt, living off his wife's family. While Novak could not find any evidence for the above event, in 1935, Florence's wife's family could no longer stand their dependent son-in-law and asked for a divorce. In 1936, Hill remarried a woman named Rosa Lee Beeland. Because they had no money, the couple moved into the small apartment of Hill's son, Mr. Blair, the only one of the children who still spoke to this conman. It was Beeland who polished Hill's words and ideas for the book and then introduced it to Pelton, who was initially hesitant because the recession was bad and he could barely afford food, let alone books. However, when it was published in 1937, Think and Grow Rich became a hit because people were desperate for life and they loved publications that encouraged them that everything would get better. So the book was like an addiction, making people forget their hunger because they believed that everything would be okay, helping them think positively and continue to work hard. Despite making a large profit from the book, Hill transferred all royalties to Ms. Beeland to avoid having to pay any financial obligations to creditors or his ex-wife and children. After receiving a large sum of money, Hill and his new wife began to live lavishly on luxury cars, jewelry, clothes, and quickly returned to a state of near bankruptcy in 1939. Tired of her useless husband, Mrs. Beeland decided to divorce Hill. While her husband was away, she sold all of her assets, including Hill's beloved car, and left him nothing. She hired a private investigator to follow her husband to get evidence of his adultery, and later married the lawyer who had defended the divorce. Glorious memories after being abandoned by his wife, Hill returned to his ex-wife Florence's house and asked to do anything to earn a few bucks to survive, but was refused. In 1941, Hill published Mental Dynamite, but no one paid any attention. In 1943, Hill married his fifth wife, Annie Lou Norman, who had a small estate but a fairly stable income. Before 1952, Hill continued to lecture and preach to make money, selling positive ideas, which he had been doing for many years. In January 1952, Hill committed his last scam in Missouri when he approached businessman W.C. Robinson and convinced him to sell a 2-month course to an entire small town. By 1955, at age 71, Hill was tired of traveling to make money. He returned to the charity calling route he had used as a scam tool, but this time to maintain his reputation at the end of his life. The Napoleon Hill Foundation was established in 1963 when most Americans had forgotten who he was, but it helped. keep Hill's name alive, and his book sold after his death. On November 8, 1970, Napoleon Hill died in South Carolina, and his wife Annie Lou began a legal battle with her husband's foundation over the rights to sell the book. The case was settled in the early 1980s.